Pandemic, one of the undisputed kings of board game series in this golden age of board games we are currently living in. If you don't know, this is a cooperative game, or initially was based on fighting off diseases around the world, but now has spread into a bunch of sort of different remakes. There's ones fighting diseases in an older time period, preventing flooding in Holland, and even fighting off enemy armies as with your Roman legions. And it turns out these are all part of a specific series called the Survival Series, which are all based on where the Pandemic Championship games are. So when they had one in Italy, that's why they had the Roman version, so on and so forth. Now this Survival Series used to be just very limited runs, but as you can guess, being already a very popular title in and of itself, these games sell very well. In particular in Europe, where most of these titles were, all the previous three, they all sold out and have a high desire for a reprint. So they've finally decided that this Survival Series shouldn't be something that's limited, that only takes place wherever the championships are and be out when they're released. Instead, they're going to have them as a regular release and have the new title attached to them involving the pandemic system, so that people can not only can consumers have a chance to pick up these titles that they missed out, but also when they're designing these games, they can be a bit more, have a bit more time because they don't have to make it by the release date, and maybe a bit more creativity too of where and what time period or fantasy takes place with this.
Steve Kimball of Z-Man Games wrote up a very interesting blog post on their website detailing the reasons behind this decision. And one of the things that he said was that a lot of people were just confused about the marketing approach of this, that they didn't even realize, A, that there was a survival championship necessarily.
I did not know myself.
Or B, if they did, they didn't realize that these games specifically were tied into it. He talked about a conversation where someone asked, like, why didn't they play the new version then in that place? They just play the original Pandemic. The messaging was a little unclear. So they're moving away from that, and also it sounds like you said, spreading them apart more, so it's not going to be like one a year necessarily. It might be every 2 years, year and a half, whatever
when they feel the game is ready, instead of making sure it's out there.
Right.
I think this is a great idea because one, they're perfecting it. Two, nothing against where the location is. I think, like they said, the current one's in Canada. Mm-hmm. But this way you can I think, allow them to do a bit more from Pandemic, which is, I think, what we'd like to see, and be a bit more creative. Though I do love the destination area, because I think it's cool to have, this is the Italy version, this is that version. Mm-hmm. And because of that, you can be a bit more creative. Like, just an example, instead of stopping cubes from coming in, like, let's say you actually are trying to protect the rainforest from being destroyed. So it's, instead of destroying cubes, it's keeping cubes on the board.
Right, like it lets them, they're not tied to where they go. They might not have a tournament in Norway, but maybe they want to do a Viking Pandemic or something like that. I think that definitely opens up a lot of avenues for them.
And as they mentioned, like the first one in the series of this now pandemic system, I think they called it.
Right, they're labeling them now as part of the pandemic system.
Is actually the Cthulhu one. Right. So this also means it doesn't have to be real life events too. They could be a bit more creative with that, I think, which is also cool.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to hear about. I swear I could be wrong, but I think we may have even done a news story like back when they first announced this series, and we talked about it, and then even I forgot that was a thing.
Well, it's not even on the box.
Right. So I think it's smart that they're doing this. There's no reason to really tie themselves to it, and I hope that we do see both, like we said, more creative ideas, and I think maybe this way we'll get less fatigue from seeing so many pandemics, because they also still have Rising Tide and Legacy, which aren't part of this series. So if you're looking at
Rising Tide is part of the Survival Series.
Oh, sorry, I said Rising Tide. I meant Rapid Response.
Yes,
they both start with an R.
Which also was very successful. And well, I think what's nice, like they show you can see with Rapid Response, is it's very different. Mm-hmm. By giving more time, you don't have to feel like just do this. It's very similar, but we'll deal with it. You can really be like, oh, let's try to really make this stand out from a base pandemic game. So you could feel more like, oh, I have Pandemic vanilla, but buying this isn't just a cheap reskin.
I also want to say, in general, I found it interesting reading this article because I don't think that I'm really conscious of how big Pandemic is for some people. I know it's obviously a huge game, very popular, but for me, in our group, it's more like, it's a gateway game, it's co-op, it's fun, the legacy version is interesting, we play it now and then, but the way they talk about it like this, yearly tournaments and championships, and that for some people, this is their game, and they are so into it.
Any of these games like that, you can just, if you're a really big fan, I'm sure you just crank it up to the hardest difficulties, and that's when you talk about how, like, tier lists and stuff of like, this character is an S tier, you almost always want them on the crew, or this one,
And it must be so interesting, the level of play for these people who've probably played it 100 times, where they just know, if I have this hand of cards, I do this, I do this.
Well, not only that, they probably also know, like, certain areas that tend to be choke points or big areas, which, if you are one of these people, please tell us. I want us to secretly, I don't want to say so we don't color, but I want to know if it's the same locations we despise.
Yeah, let us know what your Pandemic history is. I'd also like to hear from people, which of the survival series have you enjoyed? Would you like to see more? And maybe what region of the world do you think would make a good game? And what theme would you like to see?
I mean, I said mine. I actually think that the Brazilian forest idea of like reversing the idea of trying to get to grow instead of just remove cubes would be an interesting take.
Yeah. Talk to us in the comments right down below. And while you're at it, check out our description for links to our site and our social media and everything else. And stay tuned for more Pandemic stuff.
But until then, keep fighting the diseases. And I'm Will.
I'm Jonathan.
And this has been Roll for Crit.
Get an inspiration token by supporting us on Patreon and liking and subscribing to this channel.
If you support us on Patreon, you'll get access to our audio expansion podcast. It's so good.